What the heck is a brand refresh? How is it different from a rebrand? What are some of the trends that we're seeing when it comes to brand refreshes? What are we going to see in the future? Hey friends, my name is Beyerle Rosen, and I am a brand strategist here at Focus Lab. And today we're talking all about some trend forecasting for 2025. We're going to talk a little bit about brand refreshes. What the heck is a brand refresh? How is it different from a rebrand? So versus a big full-fledged rebrand where everything changes in the brand identity. With a refresh, it's smaller tweaks. So the logo might still look similar, but it's a little bit different. It's been upgraded. Same sort of thing with the color palette or the visual language. There's some elements that might have been added or removed, but a lot of it is still similar. And this is done because perhaps the brand's audience is tweaked a little bit. Maybe we're focusing more on one part of the audience versus what the traditional audience was, but a lot of it is still the same. And so this is done when you have those little shifts and you don't want to, throw it all out the window, but there's still some large elements that need to be changed. So what are some of the trends that we're seeing currently when it comes to brand refreshes? There's three that I'm going to talk about today. The first one is shifting a brand into clarity versus cleverness. So a trap that we see some brands fall into whenever they launch is that they are trying a little too hard to be clever. Maybe their tone of voice is very funny when that's really not what their audience is resonating with, or maybe they have a ton of different visual elements that they're throwing into their brand. And in the long term, it's just not sustainable. They don't have someone to implement that. Or it's just a little bit hard for them. And so something that we're seeing is brands that are pulling back a little bit because they've gone too far in one direction and things are confusing for their audience. An example of this is Verizon. They recently removed the check mark from their logo, which was such a huge part of their brand identity for a long time, but it seems like it was really cluttering things. Another one is PayPal. They just went through a big brand refresh where a lot of things stayed the same. They took away some of the stuff that wasn't working anymore. They had a ton of different colors in their brands, and they've really gone back to their basics. Another one is Rocket, like Rocket Money, Rocket Mortgage. They have this overarching brand of Rocket, which at least personally, I didn't even know existed. I was familiar with a lot of their sub brands, but they've created a very clear brand architecture so that everyone is super familiar with the parent company, which was something that may have not been happening before. And now they have a very clear organization when that organization didn't really exist before. Also, sometimes within this sort of clarity over cleverness idea, like I mentioned, a brand maybe launches with a ton of stuff. It's super opinionated. And as they grow, they need to shift with their audience. A great example of this is Robinhood, the investing app. They had a really fun and funky rebrand a couple of years ago. A lot of folks really liked it. There was a lot of different illustrations. It was very eye-catching visually. But as they've grown, they're actually having this sort of upper echelon audience, more of a high investing audience that is maybe a little more buttoned up. So they did a refresh earlier this year where they really buttoned up their brand. It looks very mature. Some folks might find it a little bit boring, but we don't know all the ins and outs of what's going on internally, but it's very clear that they want to appeal to maybe a little bit more of a corporate audience, a little bit more of a audience that wants to trust them and wants to see that their money is going to a good place. So that's been super interesting. Another theme that we've seen is also going back to your roots, or what we call debranding, going into the time machine, zooming back. A lot of this is about nostalgia. It's harkening back to maybe what things used to look like. We see it a lot on the consumer side, like Burger King a couple of years ago. They debranded to what their brand looked like in the 60s and the 70s, but they also added these new elements that felt very nostalgic and very retro. but they were very new. Walmart did this recently, just a couple of months ago. They reintroduced their Smiley, which was such a big part of like the 90s and 2000s, to roll back prices. And they really are focusing on these like fun, saturated colors that are very punchy. And a lot of this is all about like giving some more excitement to the brand. These might be brands that have kind of fallen off recently or don't feel quite as fresh. And going back to your roots can feel fresh while also feeling like you are rooted in history. It gives a reason that your audience is going to trust you. Like, oh, they've been around for a really long time. This is kind of that swinging back where there's some brands who maybe grew up and they started to pull back some versions of their brand identity and now they're re-adding them back in to seem appealing and fun and exciting to that type of audience. So we talked about kind of these three different trends. You have ones that are maybe trying too hard to be clever, so they need to slim things down and simplify it a bit. You have ones that are taking away elements of their brand because their audience is shifting. Maybe they need to grow up a little bit. And then there's also that debranding and going back to your roots idea. So, what are we going to see in the future? What are we going to see in 2025? You know, we can't completely predict the future, but something that's standing out to me from a strategy point of view is these brands, especially on the consumer side, are getting more and more opinionated. They're unafraid to show what they really believe in and what is different about them. And so that's something that I would personally love to see come over to the B2B side, to the tech side of things, to have brands be unafraid to really have this opinion. We're starting to see that a little bit, even internally. It seems like some brands that we work with are getting more and more excited to go away from these safe options and get into options that are a bit more risk taking. I'm also seeing a lot of these refreshes. In the past, used to just be logos, maybe a little logo update or a little logo tweak. Refreshes are getting bigger, where brands are now making some tweaks to their logo and then their color palette, their type, their visual language. So there's also starting to be refresh plus, like refresh pro, maybe a little more of this gray area in between the refresh and the rebrand, which is really fun. You know, there shouldn't be any limits. And so that has been really exciting to see. And so these debranding options, going back to your roots as companies get older, I think it's always wise to go back to see what was working in the past, to see if there's any lessons that we can bring forward into the future and maybe kind of go back to those things that originally inspired you. So in the future, we might see some more complex refreshes, also just getting away from the safety factor, maybe fewer refreshes overall. But I'm excited to see what 2025 brings us and what brands are going to be all about. I think there's some really exciting things in the future.